pleasure to have with us Professor Frithjof Küpper. I will say just a few words about Frithjof before I give him the floor. So Frithjof holds a chair in marine biodiversity at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And over the past 25 years, he has studied the biodiversity, ecology, and physiology of aquatic and marine plants and algae, especially in the context of biotic and abiotic stress and biochemical cycles. He has published more than 130 papers that have received more than 5,900 citations, and he has an H index of 40. It's exciting that he has worked in polar and subpolar regions of the world, and as well as on the marine biodiversity and ecology-related subject in the Eastern Mediterranean, and often employing scientific diving as a research tool. His research interests in algal halogen metabolism, pathologies, and defense reactions arose during his graduate studies for a PhD, during which he found that iodide is serving as an inorganic antioxidant in kelp, which is the first such described from a living system that has strong implications for atmospheric and marine chemistry. So this work was published in PNAS and has received substantial media coverage. As a certified scientific professional diver, he has conducted diving-based expeditions throughout the world for biodiversity-related research, such as at the Canadian Arctic, the Eastern Mediterranean, especially Greece and Cyprus, in French Polynesia, Malaysia, California, Antarctica, Asuncion Island, and the Falkland Islands, etc. Please know that Frithjof is fluent in several languages, such as English, French, and also modern Greek. Of course, he also speaks German as his native language. So I will give him the floor, and his lecture has the title of Exploration of Arctic and Antarctic Seaweed Biodiversity in the Context of Polar Climate Change. And we're eager to hear this exciting lecture. So Frithjof, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Spiro, for the invitation. Yeah, it's my great pleasure. And yeah, I have long-standing ties to Cyprus. So this is for me also quite a special event in that respect. I come to Cyprus quite often for an EU project studying the marine biological impacts of seawater desalination yeah, at the outfall. So we do a lot of diving work at the plants in Larnaca and Tekelia, and it looks like we'll be back in May, in just about 2.5 months from now. Yeah, but today I will take you to the two polar regions, to the cold parts of the world. And I will talk about polar biodiversity in the context of climate change and the fundamental problem that mankind is facing. And I believe that, yeah, everybody's certainly aware of this, is that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have been rising sharply since the beginning of industrialization. And yeah, they're currently about 50% higher than before the onset of industrialization. And they're still increasing by about 2 parts per million per year. For many years, this was with increasing speed. It seems that they are currently leveling off. This is sort of the latest data, and it's not quite clear. I mean, they were slowing down certainly because of yeah, reduced emissions during the pandemic. It remains to be seen whether this is a consistent trend that will continue. But the consequence of that certainly is that it is getting warmer. And in this graph, which is actually also quite famous, it's not my own. Yeah, citing here. This is from Dr. Ed Hawkins and the Warming Stripes Project. Yeah, a bar that is in blue simulates or indicates a year that is colder than the long-term average, and the red bar indicates a warmer year compared to the long-term average. And you can see it's very clear that in the last about 30 years, it has become markedly warmer, especially in the last decade. And this is the situation that we are facing. And I mean, many of us will certainly share this experience because it has been getting substantially warmer in much of Europe. And yeah, the last couple of summers in Central and Western Europe are definitely much hotter than the long-term average. And overall, as we look at the whole globe, it is important to note that climate change is progressing faster in polar regions at high latitudes compared to lower latitudes, and especially compared to the equator. It is estimated that roughly in the Arctic, climate change is happening about 4 times faster than, for example, in Central and Western Europe. The two main abiotic effects of this are, first of all, a shrinking sea ice cover, which is the frozen surface of the sea, frozen seawater, which is staying open for longer. And the other one is the melting of continental ice caps and glaciers, which are freshwater, which are basically compacted ancient snow. And to illustrate this, the consequence is that Arctic sea ice is declining, and it is getting both thinner and younger. And the trend is clearly towards an Arctic Ocean, which is going to be completely ice-free in the summer at some point in the nearer future. And the multi-year ice, which was 5 years older, will be almost gone very, very soon. This has consequences for one iconic animal species, and this has also been widely covered in the media. Polar bears are having a hard time because of this, because they are adapted to a specific ecological niche in which sea ice has a central importance. And that's because they need sea ice to hunt. They need the surface of the ice. They hunt chiefly seals at their breathing holes and at the flow edge, which is the margin of the sea ice. But also they need it for their offspring, for raising their babies. They dig holes in the snow layer on top of the sea ice. And as the ice recedes, this is getting harder. So in other words, they're getting a harder time both to find food and also to raise their offspring. And on dry land, polar bears lose about 1 kilo per day. That is quite a lot. I mean, even for an animal that can weigh half a ton or more. In other words, in an increasingly long Arctic summer, polar bears are at risk of starvation. And this is very nicely illustrated by this photo from our own expedition taken by my friend Peter van West. The Arctic islands in summer are mostly a rocky desert. There is not much life. It's mostly bare rock and gravel, and except of course the glaciers, but there's not much food to be found either for polar bears. So this is the situation that polar bears are increasingly confronted with. And the season when they can hunt is really whenever sea ice is around. In other words, the summer is the hungry period of the year. And this is what the projections are. This is a simulation by an American research group at the US Geological Survey. They projected the regions in the Arctic where living conditions for polar bears are going to deteriorate. And this applies for over 90% of the present range of polar bears. Red means that it is getting worse. Blue means that it is getting better. And there are also a few regions of the Arctic, like the far north here of Greenland and Northern Ellesmere Island and a few of the Siberian islands, where conditions will get better. But this is a fraction of their current range, and this cannot really compensate anything what they will lose in terms of deteriorating habitat. This is now closer to my field, and as Spira said, I work mostly on marine plants and algae. Sea ice is also an important habitat for ice algae, which is a community of microalgae, chiefly of diatoms, but also some bacteria, which live on the underside of the ice that is facing the seawater column. And they usually grow up in the polar spring when the snow layer on the surface is melting, or at least it is no longer thick enough so that light can penetrate, and there's enough light to penetrate the ice layer to promote algal growth on the underside. And this is a typical phenomenon in both polar regions. In the polar spring, the ice algal bloom usually occurs before the phytoplankton bloom in the open water. And in other words, it contributes a lot to polar primary productivity. And both by actually feeding the food web, but also it has a seeding function for a subsequent phytoplankton bloom. Many of these microalgae can live both in this glacial habitat, but also in the open water. In other words, they may initially live in a biofilm underneath the sea ice, and then when the ice breaks up, they get free floating and they seed the water column. And that means actually that the phytoplankton bloom can establish itself faster. And as this recedes, an important phase shift is underway in the pelagic Arctic, especially the Arctic ecosystem, to a lesser extent in the Antarctic. Another prominent effect that I mentioned earlier on is the loss of polar glaciers and ice shelves. Glaciers are compacted ancient snow that has accumulated on land. And an ice shelf is the floating tip, the floating end of a glacier. They are especially common in Antarctica. There are some in the Arctic, but they have receded a lot, but they're very, very common around Antarctica. And this is such an ice shelf, which I photographed actually from a small transport plane a bit over exactly 4 years ago. This is basically a glacier, which is something like 60 meters thick, covering an Antarctic fjord of this large island. Actually, Alexander Island is the largest uninhabited island in the world. Probably nobody has ever heard about it because it's uninhabited, but it's actually a very large island. And the glacier is sort of born, you could say, in the interior of this island where there's enough snowfall, and over thousands of years it compacts and then it shifts towards the sea. And what you can see here, these are meltwater ponds. They're actually very shallow, these turquoise lakes. This appears every summer. And now, of course, increasingly, they're quite shallow. I mean, they're only 0.5 meter or 1 meter deep, and this is where the ice freezes. But underneath, there's about 50, 60 meters of ice. But the global issue, of course, is that these ice shelves are increasingly being destabilized, and that is, they break off, they release icebergs, and they get smaller and smaller. And as a consequence of this, which is relevant for marine life, especially marine life on the seabed, is the so-called iceberg scouring, which is the scraping of icebergs on the seabed. You have to imagine this is like a gigantic bulldozer which hits the seabed and goes through communities of typically very slowly growing organisms, and they wreak havoc. They destroy everything in their path. And this has been intensively studied at the place where I went. This was not my own work. I have to acknowledge my colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey for this work. Of course, to some extent, this has always happened because this is the fate of any glacier reaching the sea. But this process has greatly accelerated due to the carving of ice, of shelf ices and glaciers due to climate change. And this is one of my photos, which I took there about 4 years ago. And you can see these icebergs, they're gigantic beasts. And you have to imagine that over 90% of their volume is under the sea level. I mean, this thing here is about probably 8 to 10 meters high. This is probably more. So you can imagine what a behemoth this is underwater. And when that hits the seabed, and sometimes they turn over because they melt at a different rate above and underwater. This is because of the different heat conductivity of water versus air. And then they suddenly flip over when the center of gravity changes. And you can see here, actually, these are scratch marks. This is where the iceberg has scratched along the seabed. And you can imagine what that does to any kind of marine life, like especially like corals and sponges, which are slowly growing organisms. And now I'm coming to our own work in those regions. Part of our work was to establish baseline data sets of key regions that are affected by climate change in order to well document the present or the past state, in order to assess future change. I have to say, unfortunately, climate change has obviously started. So in some of these regions, we may already be too late, but we're doing what we can to cover the present state, because I think we can expect much stronger changes in the next couple of decades. And we have done this both for the Canadian Arctic, for Baffin Island, which is one of the largest islands in the world, and also for Adelaide Island in the Antarctic Peninsula. And I led expeditions to both of these places, and then this was evaluated by myself and my group members. And the consequence when a shelf ice, a floating glacier, disappears is that suddenly large seabed areas are uncovered, and in some cases they have been covered by ice before that for thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. This is especially happening at a large scale in the Antarctic Peninsula region, on the eastern side of the Antarctic Peninsula, and that brings about fundamental changes for marine organisms. We have a switch from communities which are dominated by slow-growing consumers like sponges and corals and others, or in many cases actually very large invertebrates that can live to centuries of age, to a strong domination by surface primary production. And it means the transfer and the flux of matter and energy in such systems becomes much faster by several orders of magnitude. It's a fundamental change of the system. Of course, there is global concern about the loss of ice shelves, and that is because of the phenomenon of sea level rise. Whatever glacial ice is on land, and if that ends up melting, will contribute to sea level rise. At the moment, global sea levels are rising by about 3 millimeters a year, but this is expected to increase. And that is chiefly due to ice loss in Greenland, but also parts of Antarctica. And scientists have realized that ice loss along the coastlines of Greenland and Antarctica is not homogeneous. It's not the same along the whole coast. In fact, we have a situation where ice loss happens very fast at a few, actually very limited points, very limited regions, which are, you should imagine, like a plug of a bathtub or of a kitchen sink. If you take that plug out, then everything what is behind may follow. And one such place is the Thwaites Glacier, which scientists have labeled a doomsday glacier, because if this thing goes, it really has profound implications for human civilization because of the consequences in terms of sea level rise for low-lying coastal area. This glacier is, like I said, it's like a cork, and it has been preventing drainage of the West Antarctic so far. However, there is concern because melting has doubled in the last 30 years, and it is precisely here at this spot. This is, for anybody who knows Antarctica a bit better, this is one of the most remote areas of the continent with hardly, there is no research station anywhere nearby. In fact, most of the bases, they're here in the peninsular region, and I went to this place. This is one of the southernmost bases, but most bases are actually up here at the tip, where logistically it's the easiest for countries to maintain a research facility. There's some here and here, which is also relatively accessible from New Zealand, and the French and the Australians have a few bases here, but there's nothing in this region. It was a considerable effort to investigate this glacier in recent years. This was a US-British consortium of scientists who went there, and well, they found that sadly this thing is disintegrating at an increased speed, and we should really be concerned about this. I will explain in a few words what that does. If this glacier was to disappear, and then we have removed the plug for the West Antarctic ice sheet, this would raise sea levels by well over 3 meters worldwide. I mean, it would be the end of many major cities like Amsterdam, London, Hamburg. There are also cities in Cyprus, also Limassol would have a problem, but there are many others, New York, Miami, Tokyo, Shanghai. I mean, there are major cities in the world that would be a threat. And yeah, it's obvious. We cannot allow this to happen as mankind. I mean, this process has to be stopped. And the question is how. One, of course, is the obvious way is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But even if we were to stop them today and we were going carbon neutral as of today, the process would sadly continue for decades and possibly centuries. And therefore, we need to look a bit more at the physics of this glacier, what is happening. What is actually leading to the disintegration of the glacier is the access of slightly warmer seawater. We're not talking many degrees. We're talking probably only half a degree or 1 degree more warmer than what the seawater used to be in the Earth's recent past. And this slightly warmer seawater will reach the underside of the glacier from underneath and lead to disintegration. It's not warmer air, or much, much less. It's really what is key to this is the access of warmer seawater. And I mean, there are colleagues in glaciology discussing what you can do about it. I mean, in terms of geoengineering, and I think this question will impose itself in the next couple of decades. I mean, from 2050 onwards, this process will happen at a much increased rate compared to what it has been so far. And yeah, some colleagues are actually suggesting, and I don't want to take sides here, but some people are suggesting that it should be possible to erect something like a submarine sill. I mean, similar to the coastal engineering works that have been done in the Netherlands and the Gulf states. I mean, if you think of all these artificial islands in Dubai, but also what the Netherlands have done to build dikes and to actually drain areas that are below the sea level now. The idea is that this could be done in the polar regions, and there would be very few points. We do not have to do this all around Antarctica, but we're talking about something maybe like 50 kilometers length in the case of this glacier. That would prevent the access of warmer seawater and thus protect the glacier and stabilize the ice sheet behind it. This is, I mean, it's complete science fiction so far, but this is the kind of suggestion that are being discussed in the scientific community. And I believe this question will come. I mean, as coastal cities with very expensive buildings, with very expensive real estate get threatened, I mean, we may end up in a situation that one day people will have to pay some kind of extra property tax. And I don't think it would be astronomical to do this kind of engineering work. But back to our own work in the polar regions, and this is now a photo from my most recent trip to Rothera, to the major base of the UK in Antarctica. I will now take you to these places. As I said, the work started in northern Baffin Island, which is in the Canadian High Arctic. This is where we had our first polar expedition in summer 2009. And I'm currently actually raising funding to go back to this area. And the other place that we have studied, where I've now been twice, is Rothera. And then we've been also 7 times to the Falkland Islands, which are here in the sub-Antarctic, in the South Atlantic. And we are, as I said, we're interested in the consequences of climate change for Arctic and Antarctic seaweeds. And what that means is in the Arctic, that the species composition is becoming less Arctic in character. We have an immigration of species from the surrounding from the boreal regions of the surrounding continents. And that means there are new arrivals from both the North Atlantic and North Pacific in the high Arctic. And I think it's only a question of time when there will be an exchange of species between the two oceans, between the North Atlantic and North Pacific. And this is precisely what I would like to investigate if my current proposal gets funded, hopefully, that I would like to look into the Northwest Passage, north of the American continent. Yeah, the general challenge for assessing this kind of change is, as I said, the shortage of historic baseline data. And at the onset of this project, it was in the last years of the previous decade, this was around 2006, 2007, when we started planning this work, there were very few inventories of seaweed biodiversity of the American Arctic, which had been much less studied than the European Arctic. If you go to the area north of Norway, but also parts of Greenland, there have been quite a few more studies. And but however, the European Arctic has always been less cold because of the North Atlantic current, the Gulf Stream. And at the same time, this region has well-documented rapid climate change. And however, there have been collections and unpublished records available spanning several decades before. And here I have to pay tribute to my American friend and collaborator and mentor, I have to say, Robert Wills, from Amherst, Massachusetts, who actually passed away just 4 days ago, aged 97 years. He was the very first marine botanist working in the Arctic north of Canada and also north of Alaska for many years. He started working in the region in the 1950s under very adventurous circumstances, and he spent several winters living there with the native populations, with the Inuit. And yeah, he was a great mentor, and he incited my interest to work in this region. And this is a photo from his last expedition there, which he did in his 70s, in his high 70s. And this became also our main study site in the Canadian Arctic. It's a place called Zed Inlet in north of Baffin Island. And as you can see, in that summer, late August, there was quite a bit of sea ice around, and the sea temperature that the divers recorded was between 0 and 1 degree centigrade. And we visited this place exactly 6 years later, same calendar date, late August 2009. And the next photo is taken from where the cursor is here, from this little tip of land down there. And yeah, from down here. And the place looked like this. There was no sea ice at all in the water. And of course, one can argue this was a snapshot, but this reflects a wider trend, which is confirmed by our Canadian collaborators, but also the local context. There are people living in this area. Like I said, the Arctic has a native population, the Inuit chiefly in the American Arctic. And for them, I mean, they have seen major changes within a generation. And among the changes is also, this was pointed to out to us by our outfitter. Yeah, I had to hire an Inuit outfitter for leading this expedition, for getting all the logistics, because there was no research base or anything in the area. That is now changing, and the Canadian government is investing quite a lot of money. But as Shirti Tagak, our outfitter, pointed out, this little glacier, which had become quite small in 2009, used to reach the sea. In other words, this was in fact a small shelf ice, which used to carve icebergs until about a decade before. And this is very much receded. And this is part of a wider trend in that area. And now I will take you on a dive at the study site at Bay 11, which is at Zed Inlet. And when you stand on a polar seashore, it strikes you that they are basically a desert. You don't see any macroscopic life forms. And that is because very few organisms can survive these environmental extremes. You have to imagine that in summer, conditions are not that different from what we have here in Scotland or in Scandinavia, which is, I mean, you get air temperatures up to about 15 degrees. I mean, the sea is colder. The sea, like I said, I mean, the maximum can be in such a bay can be 5 or 7 degrees. So usually it's closer to 0. But in winter, the air temperature in these places can drop to -50 and below. And that means you have this thick layer of sea ice. And that is actually what kills all the major life forms. This is part of the abiotic environment in polar regions, that for the first 2-3 meters, which is the depth range where you get sea ice, there is no larger life. So if you want to see anything, you have to dive. There's no other way. And as you dive down for the first 2-3 meters, you see hardly anything. In fact, these little brown tufts that you can see here, this is an annual seaweed. It's mostly Pilagella. Yeah, the name doesn't really matter, but basically this is the zone, the depth zone, that is completely locked in ice for about 8 months a year. And it's only when you dive deeper that you start seeing larger things, like this one called Halosiphon. This is just at the margin of the depth of the sea ice, 3 to 4 meters. And yeah, this is a seaweed which we have growing here in northern Scotland, but also in Scandinavia, in the intertidal, in the tidal range between low and high tide. In other words, this is a shore seaweed here in northern Europe. In the high Arctic, this is a subtidal seaweed. It lives several meters deeper. It never gets into contact with air. And that's precisely because of the impact of sea ice. And this photo shows something else, these white spots here in the background. That is not dirt on the lens, on the camera, but in fact, this is large zooplankton, large crustaceans. And they are the reason, they're the food source for large baleen whales, which are common in polar waters, including in that area in northern Baffin Island. And yeah, and this is a very good example to illustrate again the effect of sea ice. This is a rock. And if this was anywhere else in the world, the top side of the rock would be densely covered in vegetation. However, this is the side of the rock that, of course, is raised by sea ice for about 7 to 8 months a year. And that's the reason why there are only small summer annuals that can live there. And all the multi-year organisms, all the larger seaweeds live on the side, which still get some light, but which significantly do not have any contact with sea ice. So this is a typical phenomenon of polar regions. And that will, I anticipate, will get less because of receding sea ice, that at the polar seabed, especially in very shallow waters, will look more and more like on the surrounding northern continents. Then at 4 to 6 meters depth, the first kelps appear. This is the group of large brown algae, the laminariales, and in other parts of the world, they start occurring at about low tide level. It means at 0 meters, and then they go down. And again, here we've got the case that the whole depth zonation, which we know from subarctic or subpolar regions, is pushed downwards by a couple of meters. This is a typical phenomenon of polar regions and a take-home message. And then, yeah, as you go deeper, you get a real forest-like community of Desmarestia aculeata. That's this wiry stuff here, and again, kelps like this one here. And there's a lot of krill. In other words, there's a lot of food for large baleen whales. And then the lower depth limit of the kelp forest becomes more like a kelp park, where you have single kelp thalli or single kelp plants, which are like single trees on a meadow. Which is about probably 12 to 15 meters. This is where the kelp forest gets quite sparse, and in between you get these red crusts, coralline red algae, which are adapted to low light conditions. And yeah, there's also attractive marine life, which doesn't move a lot. In fact, it struck us that most fish, they sit around. If you compare this to diving in Cyprus, where most fish swim quite fast, the fish in the Arctic and the Antarctic, they're actually very slow. They sit around. They don't do much. And this is actually a very good photo. I have to acknowledge Hugh Brown from the UK National Facility for Scientific Diving here, because this you can see the reflection of the diver in the eye of the fish. Okay, and as I said, at about 15 meters depth, you get this kelp park situation, and communities are dominated by coralline red algae, and kelp is getting sparse. And main take-home messages are that Arctic seaweeds are mostly subtidal or sublittoral, and that is due to the ice scouring and extreme environmental conditions, extreme temperature fluctuations. At the sea surface, yeah, in winter, temperatures can drop to -55. The summers are actually quite similar to northern Scotland. And most of you are not seaweed biologists. They will not say much about it. I mean, you get a couple of typical species like Pilagella and Fucus. There are also 4 species of kelp in the American Arctic, and also a couple of species which are endemic species of the high Arctic. And maybe you should also be concerned about those, because they have a restricted range in the coldest part of the Arctic. And as that region gets smaller, they will come under pressure inevitably. It is also very typical to find coralline red algae in polar benthic communities, and that's typically beneath 12 meters depth. And to explore the biodiversity further, we have applied a methodology which was developed by my longtime friend and collaborator, Akira Peters, who's also been to Cyprus with me, which consists of collecting samples of the benthos, of the seabed, of the substratum in sterile tubes, in Falcon tubes. I'm sure that those of you who do molecular biology know what a Falcon tube is. And we dive actually with them, and then we fill them in situ at our dive site. And the advantage is that we capture everything that's in there, but that may not be visible to a diving observer. And then subsequently, they're taken back to the lab where they're incubated in suitable culture conditions. And then we characterize all the arising cultures by molecular and microscopic means. And molecular means, that's conventional DNA barcoding, chiefly of the COX-1, COX-3, and ITS markers. And that has revealed, in this place in Baffin Island, which was the first place where we applied this as a large scale, but also since then at numerous other places in the world, a number of previously unsequenced and possibly novel taxa to science. And this is an overview. This is a phylogenetic tree. Probably the most interesting case is up here. Desmarestia is a genus of quite large brown algae. They can attain several meters in size. There was one in my photos earlier on. And based on the sequences, this is a species which is undescribed so far. Yeah, it has 5.7% difference at the COX-1 level. So that is enough for algal taxonomists to say this must be a new species. And thankfully, we have it growing in culture here in Aberdeen. We have 2 isolates which are alive, and I will probably give it to a student to formally describe the species. And there are several others which we only know by the numbers of these cultures. We have them growing here. So if anybody wants to describe new species of seaweeds from the Arctic, contact me. I'm always looking for good students to do this work. So there are quite a number. We can't give them names yet. So there are several of them. And interestingly, also in cases of known genera, we uncovered a cryptic diversity like Pilayella, that there are in fact 3 species, in fact, instead of the 1 which had been previously reported for the region. If you start looking more closely and especially doing barcoding, you may uncover more species. A particularly interesting case was that of these 2 endemic algae of the American high Arctic, Platysiphon and Platyarcticus. Platysiphon had been described by my late friend Bob Wills. And so far, prior to this work, it was not clear really what is their taxonomic status, their phylogenetic affinity, and they look quite different. These are 2 photos taken during our expedition, and then as sequencing work was done in the lab of my Japanese friend Harashi Kawai, they found that this is actually the same thing. And we now think that what you have here on the left, the Platysiphon, is the juvenile form, and what you have on the right is the adult, the perennial form. And what is in between in development is at least 1 winter under sea ice. And this is the hypothetical life cycle. It was not yet possible to complete the whole life cycle in culture. This is quite tricky, and you have to imagine that these are organisms that are adapted to living at about 0 degrees. Seawater freezes at minus 1.8 degrees. And it's very hard to grow large polar seaweeds in the lab. This is a general challenge for any seaweed algal research in polar regions. And now we are going to make a big leap from one side of the globe to the other. I'm now going to take you to the Antarctic, to Rother Research Station, which is the major base of the UK in Antarctica. Yeah, it is one of the few bases where you can fly by plane, and that makes it actually quite easy to get there, relatively speaking. It's only a 5-hour flight from the southernmost tip of South America, but that makes it really easy for scientists to get there and to work. And it's still a very long trip, both getting there, but also if you are there, you're not just going there for a week. I mean, a typical stay of any scientist visiting there is something like to stay 6 weeks or longer in that place. And I've now been there twice, and it's a pretty spectacular place. This is a photo taken in the midnight sun. Of course, I was there in the summer, when the sun for most of the time would not go behind the below the horizon. And it was also the best time for photography. Actually, around midnight, you had an increased red contribution in the light spectrum. At midday, it has a very intense white or a very intense blue light, and you don't get that many colors on your photos. But it's also a place where the impacts of climate change are manifest. And I took this photo from a spot, as it was explained to me by the skipper of this boat. The glacier in the background had reached about 20 years earlier. In other words, this glacier, called the Sheldon Glacier, has receded by about 3 kilometers in 20 years. That's quite a lot. And you can imagine that there's a lot of seabed opening up underneath. And that's exactly that phenomenon that I mentioned earlier on. that we have a complete phase shift from a system which is controlled or dominated by slow-growing consumers to a system with intense primary production during the summer months. The slow-growing consumers would only live basically by the inwelling of biomass, by the little biomass that would be carried underneath the ice by ocean currents. And now we've got a totally different system because of climate change. And this is how the glacier disintegrates. These are icebergs in the making. So what's the interest to study Antarctic seaweeds? And it's pretty similar, like what you could say for the Canadian Arctic, is that the region where I went had been very poorly studied prior to our work, and at the same time it is affected by strong ongoing climate change with very significant consequences. There are major changes in temperature and light exposure, as illustrated by the previous photo. There is sea ice recession. In other words, the frozen surface of the sea is also receding. It's getting less and less every year. There's increased iceberg scouring, which other colleagues, in particular, my friend Lloyd Peck at the British Arctic Survey has studied with his team. And also an increased input of glacial meltwater. As glaciers melt in inlets and bays, you get a lot of fresh water coming in, and of course that affects also marine life. So you have got changes of salinity, and all these have impacts on, especially sessile, on benthic seabed communities, and that can result and will likely result in shifts of geographical distribution and also depth zonation. And it was possible to undertake this study again because there are now new methods in phycology and seaweed biology available, in particular culturing molecular techniques. And this was the only study prior to ours in that region, conducted by my American colleagues, Digmo and Delaka, who went there in the early 1970s and published it in '76. And they were able to do a total of 4 dives here in this region of Margaret Bay. They had to work from a research vessel. They didn't spend much time on land, but they went there with a research vessel that sailed up and down the Antarctic Peninsula. And they came up with an impressive list of species. And there were also, of course, the sites, the stations, which are close to mine. The place that I visited is here where the circle intersects with the Adelaide Island coastline. This is where Rother is located. They didn't exactly visit the same place where I've been, and or nor did I visit their sample stations. And when comparing their results to mine, in comparison, I was able to do 17 dives there during this field campaign in 2010, 2011. And that was because I had the advantage, I have to say, the logistic advantage of being at a base with a very good diving facility and a support team of divers, whose only job basically was to support my diving during this campaign, as opposed to, I imagine, I mean, if they were on a research vessel, there was a lot of other science going on, and they couldn't have probably the vessel for the entire time for themselves. So I had a clear advantage in my own campaign being based there locally. On the other hand, I was not able to revisit their sites because it's actually very hard to get around in Antarctica. And then we compared the species which were only observed in 1975 and which I observed, and there were in fact only 6 species in common between the 2 expeditions. And how can we explain this? There were lots of differences, and we published this work a few years ago, and our campaign resulted in 18 newly recorded taxa for Adelaide Island and Margaret Bay. And the most obvious explanation is that there's still a limited range in number of surveys, and that there is a large variation between sites. In other words, the micro-environmental conditions may be very different between one site and another. And this is also what I saw actually doing my own diving when visiting these about 5 dive stations. There were big differences. Of course, there is the possibility that since 1975, there has been a massive southward movement of species into that region, of species which used to live further north in lower latitudes and towards higher latitudes, and also that high latitude species may have been replaced or may have disappeared. And that is plausible. It may be the case. It's impossible to say this conclusively right now. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the fastest warming regions on Earth. The other one is the American High Arctic, and we've got exactly the same issues there. I think it's fair to argue that there's still a lot to discover in terms of polar seaweed biodiversity, and for assessing the impacts of climate change in the polar regions, but certainly also in many other bioregions in the world. we have a critical lack of historic baseline data sets of species distributions and ranges. And this is particularly critical in polar regions, which are changing faster than lower latitudes. And still, I would argue that the combined data set of these campaigns that we've conducted, they now represent a useful data set for future comparisons. If somebody goes back in 20, 30 years from now, they can rely upon this work and assess any potential changes. And yeah, there's a strong need to conduct more such surveys before changes get really major. And this is now the outlook, what I would like to look at. I mentioned that I anticipate that at some point, the disappearance of sea ice, especially north of the American continent, will lead to an exchange of species between the North Atlantic and North Pacific. This is the so-called Northwest Passage, and it has a mythical significance in navigation history. In the 19th century, a number of expeditions tried to find this mythical passage, which geographers postulated must exist, and they couldn't find it. In fact, it was only discovered quite late by Roald Amundsen, and several very well-equipped expeditions failed. And a particularly tragic case is this one here of HMS Terror and HMS Erebus of the Royal Navy, led by Franklin, which were lost in sea ice. They never came back. Not a single person returned alive. And only a few years ago, only 5-6 years ago, the 2 shipwrecks were found in very remote areas. And they were largely intact. They're quite well conserved. The boats were crushed, but whatever sank to the seabed is quite well conserved. And this is now being studied by historians. So until recently, the seaway was not accessible for shipping by year-round ice, but it's now open. And in fact, in summer, it's such because it's completely open water that you can basically take a sailing yacht through. It's still not an easy thing to do because you find no logistics. There are no port infrastructures in over very long distances. So it's not an easy thing for an amateur captain to go there, but in theory you can. But in the 19th century, it was closed by ice, and there was no hope of getting through. And it has been a barrier for marine life, for species exchange between the Atlantic and Pacific. And I'm currently trying to get the funding to look at this, both to document the present ranges and also potential range shifts in the nearer future. And with this, I would like to close here. This was the scientific part of my talk. I don't know if we should take questions now. Otherwise, I have a few slides. It's not very long, probably only about 10 minutes to show what such a trip to Antarctica looks like, which is more about the working side. But I'll leave this to our chair, to Spiros. So I'm available, now for comments and questions.
Thank you very much. This was a very exciting talk. We became a bit colder than we are now in Cyprus, but that's okay. We need it here in Cyprus sometimes to get a bit cool. So anyway, maybe we can take a couple of questions before you go on with the slides. Let's see if there are questions from the audience. You can also place your questions. You can also type your questions in the chat if you like. So I see Luis is trying to ask something. Yes, Luis, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Küpper. Very, very interesting talk, and it's fascinating to me how you can manage to do research both in the polar regions but also in Cyprus, which I'm also interested in listening on what exactly you are working on. And with that, having said that, please, next time you're in Cyprus, you're invited to visit us at the Cyprus Marine and Maritime Institute, perhaps to give another talk.
I would love to. And we can do such a talk also in a lecture theater, in a classroom. We can easily do this.
Yeah, definitely. So just a simple question, because you mentioned that there is lots of endemic species that are being in decline. I don't know whether you have any indications if those endemic species that are specific in the polar regions, you already mentioned that they're being displaced by species coming from other regions, further south or further north, depending on where. So those endemic species, do you have numbers? Do you have any substantial quantifications on how much they have been affected?
No, we don't. And there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, something which would be straightforward in a place like Cyprus in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is the most intensely studied marine water body in the world. I mean, it just doesn't exist. There's virtually nothing like this for the whole for both polar regions.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you at least have some data from 1976 from that expedition to compare with, and hopefully you'll manage to visit again and keep track of what is going on. Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
So there's another question in the chat by the secretary. I don't know who the secretary is, but anyway, that says that probably in the Scotia expedition of 1904, they collected seaweeds in the South Orkney Islands, which are a bit further than Adelaide. And the question is, has anyone been back to the South Orkneys to compare, to do comparison?
Not recently. It is a place that I tried to visit at some point. It didn't work out. I tried actually to organize an expedition during my first years in my previous job at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. No, nobody has been back there. So far, people have been back to, there has been quite a bit of seaweed research around, especially King George Island, also Half Moon Island and Deception Island, but the South Orkney Islands, the whole Scotia arc has not really been studied for seaweeds since then. I mean, you mentioned the Scotia expedition by William Spears Bruce, and there has been nothing since then. It would be, there's a lot of scope to do this.
Yes, that would be very interesting to see, to compare.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I mean, there's a strong bias in Antarctica, a strong geographic sampling bias. It's chiefly around King George Island and a few places further north in the Antarctic Peninsula, like I said, Half Moon Island, Anvers Island, even Rothera, where I was. I mean, there were only basically now 3 expeditions of Mount Telaka in the 70s, and now our 2 expeditions. And that's it. And most of Antarctica is not surveyed. I mean, we can safely say that 90% of Antarctica's coastline has not been surveyed, of the continental coastline has not been surveyed for seaweeds.
Okay. So any other question, anyone? So maybe if you start showing the photos, then
okay. I will go ahead with this. So I will do stop share here and switch to another screen. And I will probably close this one exactly, and I will switch to this one. Actually, I had, this is a presentation which I had originally prepared for a kindergarten in Vrilicia in the north of Athens. Keep inviting me. Now I've been on a nice trip, they invite me and to talk to the 4- and 5-year-old children. So this is what you're going to see now. So this was my latest trip to Antarctica in 2017-18, and it started at my home. This is the view from my home here in Aberdeen, where I'm sitting right now, which is on the tidal estuary at sunrise. This was mid-December, when which is a season when we get these beautiful sunrises. And yeah, I flew from Aberdeen to London Heathrow, and then from there to Sao Paulo, and then to Santiago de Chile, and finally to Punta Arenas here in the south of South America. That's the southernmost city of Chile, and there we got stuck for almost 4 days, and we couldn't travel further because for this last leg from Punta Arenas to Rothera, there is a point of no return for the flight. In other words, if the plane has passed that point, it has to go to its destination. It does not have enough fuel to fly back to South America. So it's a very consequential, a very responsible decision of the pilots. Whenever conditions are suboptimal, or even if there's any likelihood that they could change in a way that you can't land there, they don't fly. They take 0 risks. And that means you may spend a lot of days, which you didn't expect in a hotel in Punta Arenas, doing nothing or doing sightseeing. You can't even go far because you're basically on standby. They may tell you with 2 hours notice you have to go to the plane, so you can't even travel around this part of Patagonia and go sightseeing. You can walk around town, but you have to be reachable. And this is the plane that will take you there. It's a Dash 7. It's a model that is now quite rare, actually. It's used because it can land on very short runways, and they do not need to be paved. So it's ideal for Antarctica, and also it is a 4-engine plane. In other words, if 1 or 2 engines fail, it's not a disaster. It can still fly. And unlike commercial flights, you can visit the pilots throughout the whole flight. I mean, there's 0 security. It's very pleasant. And, it's a small community where everybody knows everybody else. I knew the pilots from my previous trip to Antarctica, and after about 2 hours, 2.5 hours of flight, Antarctica appears underneath. They don't fly very high, which means you have spectacular views. It's usually under the cloud cover. And yeah, this was the first day of arrival, which was actually, it was Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 2017, when I arrived, and there was a Christmas dinner. They had waited for us in the canteen for the crew who were on that flight. And afterwards, like almost every evening, I went outside and yeah, I photographed wildlife and scenery. And this is the main building with the canteen and the library and the bar. And there are a number of buildings. There's a fuel tank farm because the space so far needs a lot of heating fuel, but also aviation fuel, which is brought there by ship. And yeah, this is one of the buildings with accommodation. This is the sewage treatment plant. And there's a lot of wildlife around. As you walk around between the buildings, you see all these Antarctic animals like from an Attenborough movie lying around. And they are fearless. They have no, because there was no hunting in the recent past, they have lost any fear of human beings. And sometimes you have to go out of their way. You're not supposed to touch them. And yeah, that's what they look like. This is a Weddell seal. And these are the biggest seals in the world. These are elephant seals. They can attain up to 3 tons in weight. You don't want to mess with these guys. They just take over. I mean, if they block your way, you have to take a detour. There's no way you can push them out of the way. And yeah, this is again a Weddell seal. And yeah, this is typical behavior of elephant seals. They fight. It's like wrestlers. They thrash their chests against each other. It's typical behavior, which must be in their genes. You see this already in the babies. And yeah, this is a crab eater seal. That's a skua. This is one of the top predators. They go after yeah, other birds, especially penguins. This is an elephant seal in the water, so it was actually cold there, no doubt. And yeah, sometimes you're lucky to see orcas and minke whales. There are 2 main whale species which occur in the area, and they can be quite commonly seen. This is from the wharf, from the pier, where the vessels arrive, and also which we used for diving. And one day, yeah, we were alerted that there's a pod of minke whales around. There are lots of penguins. Of these Adelie penguins mostly. There are 2 other species, chinstrap penguins, which sometimes occur in summer, and rarely you also get emperor penguins. This is another top predator, which is actually yeah, quite an obstacle for diving. This is a leopard seal. That's another top predator. And whenever they show up, you're not allowed to dive. And before diving is scheduled, somebody has to do seal watch for an hour and check out the whole area with binoculars. And if a leopard seal is spotted, then nobody is allowed in the water. And that's because actually the only ever fatal accident with a leopard seal happened here at Rothera in 2003, when a snorkeling PhD student, yeah, very unfortunately, was dragged to 72 meters depth, and well, she had no chance. She drowned. And we know this exactly what happened because she was wearing a dive computer which recorded the profile of the dive, which was then evaluated. And so safety is now super strict whenever they show up, and there are a lot of them, which means that I would say probably on about 50% of days that you spend in this place, you cannot dive because there are leopard seals around. They're everywhere. They're super common. And wildlife nature is very photogenic, no doubt. This is a supermoon. One night, yeah, I went outside. I hadn't really read about this, but this was a day when the moon was closer to the Earth than usual. I went on a hike around midnight. This was towards the end of my stay, when the sun was already just below the horizon for about 2 hours. And then the supermoon rose, and I got these photos of penguins with a supermoon. Yeah, you can spend hours photographing wildlife. When you're not diving, this is what the conditions may look like for doing any kind of marine field work, also diving work. We use these small ribs or zodiacs. These are typical conditions. You might get drifting snow, and somehow you still want to get the work done, and you will do work when there are no leopard seals around. The dive equipment is quite heavy. You carry a lot of stuff, and you obviously wear dry suits. I mean, it's an astronaut-like feeling, actually. There's no bit of your body surface is in contact with the seawater, so you don't really feel it, probably except at the extremities. I mean, the hands get a bit cold because this is the gloves, even if you wear mitts, they're the thinnest, the least insulated part of your equipment. Significantly also, you wear these full face masks, which have a voice communication system with the surface team. This was also imposed after this leopard seal accident 19 years ago, and we had to abort a dive when a leopard seal showed up next to the boat, which had the surface team, and they called us, come up and don't even do a safety stop. There's a leopard seal around. So that's a common situation, and this is what marine life looks like. It's actually very colorful. Antarctica is normally famous for fantastic visibility for most of the year. I was there during the season when there's the summer phytoplankton bloom, which is very intense, and visibility is only maybe a meter or two. It was actually getting better towards the end of each day, but when you get there around Christmas time, this is the peak season of the phytoplankton bloom, and the ice is just broken up. And you get soft corals like this Alcyonium antarcticum. This myself, this is what my dive buddy took. And that's also the period when the base is resupplied by large vessels. This is the James Clark Ross, which is now being phased out because the UK has built a much bigger research and supply vessel, but this has served this purpose for over 30 years. And that brought much of the cargo and fuel together with another one, the Shackleton. And when a ship arrives, that is called relief, and then everybody on base can't do any research for about 2 or 3 days. You help hauling cargo. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to unload, especially foodstuffs and drinks, and all this has to go to the right places. It's a big operation, and everything else on base is shut down when that happens. Yeah, during those days, I was there also during New Year's Eve. It's a very special thing to welcome a new year in Antarctica because it's in sunlight. At midnight, there's sun. This is the midnight sun. And then everybody congregates on this memorial hill and welcomes the new year. And on some days, yeah, actually I was waiting during the second trip. I was waiting for quite a long time for my equipment, which had gotten delayed. Despite sea ice generally declining, the supply vessel, the Shackleton, hadn't got through to Rotorua. It was supposed to be there 2 months earlier, and it couldn't because of sea ice. It means my equipment was initially delayed, and I couldn't do any diving. So I helped another friend and colleague, Matt Davey from Cambridge, who was working on snow algae. This is Matt, and he's now in Oban. And he was studying algae living on snow fields. This is quite a common phenomenon in high mountain areas like the Alps, but also polar regions, that in summer, the snow turns green or red. And that's because of microalgae living in the snow. And that's exactly what he works on. And yeah, that's him in the lab. There's a fantastic lab for biological and geosciences at Rotorua. In fact, it's several rooms with a superb equipment. I mean, it's like in a very well-equipped university. It could be actually a molecular lab at the University of Cyprus. I would say it's a comparable standard. You can do a lot of work there. And yeah, there's also a good medical facility. Of course, things can go wrong. And at any time, year-round, there are 2 doctors on service. And somebody is on duty 24/7 all the time. And yeah, for going there, I mean, you have to do all kinds of medical checks. They want to exclude people yeah, getting into trouble for trivial things. I mean, like problems with your teeth. This is something, I mean, you have to go to a dentist before you go there. And I can imagine that the coronavirus pandemic posed particular challenges for Antarctic research. Rotorua, one should say, thankfully, it didn't have many scientists during the pandemic because they were doing major building works. So there were fewer scientists than usual. They built a new pier and another new building. This is the room where I stayed. For most of the time, I had it on my own. It's pretty much a youth hostel style, I would say, but sometimes it got full. And that's because the space is also like a hub for scientists going elsewhere in Antarctica. They may come on a plane or leave on a plane, and then they go on smaller planes or other vessels. They go somewhere else. So it's also a bit of a hotel for people in transit. Yeah, I didn't sleep that well in this place. It's actually quite noisy, and especially if you have roommates. So I spent a lot of time outside. And one day I was fortunate to participate in the flight of this twin otter, which is used for deep Antarctic missions in the interior of Antarctica and other smaller islands. Yeah, when you can't do diving, then you can basically volunteer to be a flying assistant to help the pilot moving cargo. And that's what we did. So it was myself and the pilot who flew about 600 kilometers south to deliver some fuel to an outpost. Yeah, this is a view back to the base. And this is the ice shelf that I had shown before in my previous talk. This is yeah, the King George ice shelf flying to Alexander Island. And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, they fly by satellite navigation, but there's no ground control or anything. And when there's a cloud layer, they may fly below the clouds to be able to see obstacles. Yeah, which is maybe not for everybody to imagine that you basically rely on the vision of the pilot and not much else. So here we are actually below the cloud cover. We are at only maybe 100 or 150 meters altitude. This area is called Fossil Bluff, and you can see these are sedimentary rocks, and they have lots of fossils in them. That's a selfie, and yeah, that's all the cargo we brought. You can imagine how expensive it is to bring fuel to such a place. I mean, basically, we did this whole big flight. We were traveling for most of a day to deliver 4 drums of fuel to this outpost. yeah, at the end of my stay, as summer was progressing, it was actually getting relatively warm by Antarctic standards. Wildlife showed up that wasn't there for most of the year, like these fur seals. They live normally further north at the tip of the peninsula or even in South America, and they swim deeper into Antarctica towards the end of summer. And yeah, this is another nice shot. This is a penguin on an iceberg. And then the trip came to an end. Yeah, I flew back actually via the Falkland Islands, and from there on a Royal Air Force plane via the Cape Verde Islands to the UK. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think we're doing okay with time. That's basically it.
Thank you very much
sharing, yeah,
for this exciting tour. It seems very, very nice. It's an amazing place, amazing photos. So, Alois, you wanted to ask something more? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Spiros. As a scientific diver myself, I found myself encountering monk seals in the waters of Cyprus, which of course,
this is something I have not done yet.
Yeah, it doesn't compare at all with encountering leopard seals. So my question would be, apart from, of course, being exciting, what is exactly the procedure you need to follow when you encounter one in the water? You mentioned that they told you to resurface without doing your safety store, yes, of course. But what is exactly the procedure if the animal is right next to you, and of course you might be not able to surface immediately? Is there a protocol, yes, to follow?
Yes, your dive buddy, which is usually, I mean, the whatever diving assistant of the base, carries a seal prod. It's basically like a boomstick. It's a metal stick to scare the seal away. This is, I mean, it's not sharp or anything, but it's enough to scare the seal. And then you're supposed to make a controlled ascent. That's the procedure when a leopard seal shows up. And it happens often. I mean, I've heard lots of stories, and I didn't actually see the leopard seal myself in the water because we had like half a meter visibility, but it was the surface team that saw the leopard seal right above our dive site, and we were tethered to the boat by a rope. So the surface crew knows where the divers are, and they told us, "It just come up."
So yeah, with low visibility, it must be even more scary.
Yeah, you rely on each other. This is the thing. You rely very much on your dive buddy and your surface team. I mean, the good thing with the rope is that you can't get lost. You always know where your partners and where the surface team are. And of course, there's another common situation is that you might, even in the summer, you may find yourself underneath the ice, underneath icebergs. This easily happens. And we've had that situation. And then suddenly you've got a wall of ice or a ceiling above you, and the rope shows you how to get out.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Frithjof, for such a fascinating talk, and your photography was amazing. Really.
Thank you.
But I must say that at the same time, it was quite disconcerting regarding climate change. The Doomsday Glacier, which is melting away. Yeah. I mean, yeah, while worrying whether we'll die from a nuclear holocaust now, at the same time, this threat is continuing. Sorry, a very naive question, but I mean, is anything being done? I mean, this engineering intervention, you said it's been discussed, but it's still science fiction.
Yeah, it is being discussed. I actually corresponded with one of the scientists proposing this at Princeton University, and they're saying that we should basically do a small proof of concept study at an easily accessible glacier in Greenland. Greenland is much more accessible than Antarctica. I mean, there are ports and airports, and people live there. And this should be tried, this approach of building a submarine skill. And mankind has the technology. It's, I think it's mostly a question of logistics, of moving this kind of marine excavators, I mean, which are used around ports like Rotterdam or Dubai. They're being used all the time. It's a question of moving them to polar regions and getting them to work there. Yeah, I think this question will arise. This is inevitable. I think there will be massive economic pressure in a few decades to do this kind of thing.
And what would the cost of such an endeavor be? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, Yeah, we discussed this a bit. It would probably not be outrageous. I mean, for building such a dike, I mean, we are probably looking at something for a glacier in Greenland at something in the range of the low billions of euros. I mean, compared to what the present war in Ukraine costs and now the money that countries like Germany has just decided we are going to spend 100 billion euros extra this year on defense. I mean, compared to this is absolutely realistic, an absolutely realistic figure. It's not outrageous. I think the money will be mobilized when the threat increases. Right now, it's not yet that much on people's mind. I mean, not many areas are being flooded yet, but that will change. I mean, when whole countries go under, like the Maldives and Nauru and others, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, and even more when major cities are being threatened. I mean, where we have hundreds of trillions of euros or dollars worth of real estate, when they're being threatened, I think money will be mobilized to do something about this. The question is, won't it be too late? But I mean, this will continue, and this question will arrive even if we shut down CO2 emissions today. Because of the lethargy, you could say, of a glacier. This process of glacier disintegration will continue, even if we go carbon neutral today.
Thanks.
Okay, speaking about science fiction, two things. Probably you know that this story about the terror has been the basis of a TV series.
Yes.
A couple of years ago. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, probably the photo that you showed us is from the series, because okay. And the second thing that is related with that, you said about the northern passage that is opening, so that the two oceans might communicate sometime soon. Okay, there was another science fiction movie the day after that was based on the disruption of the Gulf Stream due to climate change. So what do you think, what are the possibilities that this opening of the Northern Passage and all these things can affect the Gulf Stream? So the climate changes in another way.
Yes, I'm not a physical oceanographer, but I know people in the scene. And I mean, there's a lot of concern that the North Atlantic current, the Gulf Stream, is slowing down. And if that was to happen, I mean, that would revert the process for this part of Northern Europe where I'm right now. I mean, we would probably get a climate that would be similar to the American East Coast. And if you look at the same latitude, I mean, I'm here at 58 degrees north. If you go that far north in North America, you're in the north of Labrador. There's hardly anybody living. I mean, the biggest communities have about 5,000 people. There are no roads. There are polar bears roaming free. I mean, it's the kind of climate that one might get if that was to happen. At the moment, we are seeing, of course, a warming climate also in much of the British Isles. But if the Gulf Stream was to shut down or quickly decrease, I mean, we would get a very abrupt change to something else. Yeah, the main concern probably about climate change is, actually, I'm pretty confident that life on Earth will survive, but the trouble is what will happen to human civilization, to a highly developed civilization and human economies with complex systems of food supply and civilization patterns. Much of the human population lives in coastal areas. We have more humans to feed than ever before. This is the real concern. I mean, whether we can sustain civilizations. And civilizations have disappeared in the past because of environmental change. There were, I mean, for example, when this little ice age started, the Vikings were wiped out from Greenland. Greenland became too cold around the year 1300. There was a small urban population of Vikings in various coastal places in Greenland. And the only people who survived were the Inuits, who were not nomads, who did not live in settlements, had no agriculture. They managed to survive. Another place is Easter Island. There's a very good book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, how civilizations choose to survive or to disappear, about that subject.
Thank you. So there's another question, Lenin.
Yes, hi. Great talk, amazing talk. Thank you. I'm actually connected from Glasgow, so close by.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I was wondering, like, all the seaweed research that you did, do you think it could be integrated into the seaweed farming that's now uprising here in Scotland, and it's trying to elevate around the world or so?
I think it's potentially a way to sustainably generate income for First Nations in the Arctic region. I mean, as I said, especially the American Arctic has a native population, and the seabed with many little bays and fjords is potentially suitable for mariculture. I mean, if there's any economic value in these seaweeds as food supplements for humans or any other pharmaceutical purpose, then I think this is a potential to develop in a sustainable economy in those places. I think there would be a lot of interest in that because these populations are very poor. Economically, they're desperately poor. Actually, I had to think when visiting Baffin Island that being a First Nation person there is almost like living in an open air prison because they don't have the income to fly anywhere else in Canada. There's no way out by road. I mean, you're confined to this little place. You can travel locally on boats or in winter on a snowmobile. But to book a flight to a place like Toronto or Ottawa, I mean, you spend like $4,000. And most people, the per capita income among the Inuit is about $15,000 a year. So it's just not on. I mean, these people cannot afford to travel anywhere. It's a desperately poor region. The Canadian government is not trying to invest a lot of money, but there are huge socio-economic issues. There's a very high rate of alcoholism, and the suicide rate is the highest in all of Canada. The rest of Canada is very much like Western Europe, and it has a very highly developed healthcare system, but the First Nation population in the Arctic is very deprived. And yeah, there are huge socio-economic issues. So anything that would contribute to a sustainable development would probably be very welcome there.
Very interesting, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So if there is another question, we can thank you again.
Excellent, yeah, and hope to see you in 2.5 months in Cyprus. Hopefully peace has returned to Europe by then. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in person.
Of course, you're welcome. We're looking forward to it.
Excellent.
So we'll also thank everyone that attended this lecture, and have a nice evening. And let's hope for peace soon.
Indeed. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.